Welcome to History Twists, where we ask the one question that drives historians mad. What if it had gone differently?
I'm Sean Deneen with my good friend Dr. William Weaver. Today's twist: what if Richard Nixon had won the 1960 election?
No Kennedy, no Camelot, no Bay of Pigs. Instead, according to this history twist, we get a cold warrior president right out of the Eisenhower mold. Oh, yeah, he's the one who was in 1954, got us into Vietnam. Oh, but that's a different thing. Of course, it said that Nixon had sharper elbows.
And in this scenario, a greater willingness to roll the dice. This brings us to two wild cards of the early 1960s: the breakaway state in the Congo called Katanga, and a tiny, obscure region of Indonesia, Ambeno, where Nixon's administration sees not just rebellion, but opportunity.
So let's start in November 1960. It's tight, but Nixon edges out Kennedy thanks to a stronger performance in Illinois and a cleaner count in Texas. The tide shifts. Nixon becomes the 35th president.
And unlike Kennedy, Nixon doesn't believe in third world neutrality. You are either with the West or you're with Moscow. There's no middle ground.
He keeps most of Eisenhower's foreign policy team in place. John Foster Dulles' younger allies, the CIA hawks, and crucially, old school colonialists in the French and Belgian intelligence services get, well, what we call backdoor access to American ears.
So let's start by talking about Congo. In the real world, Congo gains its independence in 1960 and chaos erupts. The mineral rich province of Katanga, led by Mosi Tshombe, declares its independence. Belgium backs it, the UN condemns it to the point of sending a peacekeeping force, and the United States plays it very cautiously under Kennedy.
Not in this new Nixon world. He smells a Cold War opportunity. Katanga isn't just rich, it's anti communist, pro Western, and run by a man willing to host American advisors.
As one of his campaign promises, Nixon had said, and this was announced by his running mate, Henry Cabot Lodge, but it was his decision, the administration would appoint an African American cabinet member. Well, in our little story here, as a bone to the journalism community, George F. Schuler, see our Strange Bedfellows podcast to learn more about him, is appointed as Assistant Secretary of State with cabinet rank. He also happens to be the poster adult for Katanga's succession. In early 1961, the Nixon administration recognizes Katanga as a sovereign ally. It's very controversial. The UN protests. Much of Africa is outraged, but Nixon frames it as necessary to stop Soviet-aligned chaos in Leopoldville.
CIA advisors, military contractors, and even corporate geologists pour in. American mining firms sign deals with the Sombe, bypassing Congolese national control entirely.
Patrice Lumumba, in this world, is captured much earlier, and the United States backs his exile to Guinea rather than his execution. Dushanbe spins it as a humanitarian gesture. Nixon calls it a moment of African self-determination.
Now, this is where it gets even stranger. Half a world away in Indonesia lies a sliver of territory called Ambino, part of East Timor, Catholic, coastal, and neglected by Jakarta.
In our world, it never fully breaks away. A brief attempt at secession is crushed until much later, after much bloodshed. But in this Nixon timeline, the State Department and the CIA spot parallels with Katanga: ethnic difference, resentment of central rule, and most importantly, access to strategic maritime lanes near Australia.
With whispers from Portuguese and Vatican back channels, Nixon quietly encourages local leaders in Ambino to declare independence in 1962, citing religious persecution and Indonesian communist infiltration.
It's classic Nixon: bold, deniable, and very risky. Navy ships coincidentally begin visiting Dill, and American humanitarian groups flood the area with aid, radios, and power generators, many of whom double as intel gathering hubs.
Jakarta erupts. Sukarno declares the U.S. an imperialist vampire. Nixon doubles down, warning of a red arc from Beijing to Jakarta and saying Ambino represents freedom's flicker in Southeast Asia.
NATO is torn. France and Portugal cheer Nixon's aggressiveness. The UK is skeptical. The UN holds emergency sessions over Congo and Ambino.
Indeed, when I was alive during that period of time, we used to call it the bongo and the Congo.
I could see why.
uh, Inside the U.S., liberals howl. Senator Fulbright calls it a betrayal of African and Asian hopes. But Nixon's approval rating in this scenario climbs, especially amongst defense hawks and Cold War conservatives.
The Soviets respond naturally. They send military advisors to Leopoldville and Jakarta. Soviet aligned militias in Congo grow in strength. In Indonesia, Sukarno leans much closer to China.
But here's the twist: the Nixon doctrine, the idea of backing proxy regimes with air power, advisors, and local control, begins here. Long before Vietnam escalates, you see the blueprint in Katanga and Ambino. By the end of Nixon's first term, he coined a new phrase: secure the minerals, secure the margins. It became the mantra of U.S. foreign policy through the 60s.
So, what happens next? By 1964, Katanga is a de facto American protectorate. The Belgians are not thrilled, but they're satisfied to keep some mining rights. The UN pulls out, and Dushanbe survives two coup attempts with CIA support.
Katanga becomes a test lab for Cold War capitalism with mixed results. Corruption, yes, but infrastructure booms and it's used to showcase anti Soviet development.
Ambino, meanwhile, is a slow burn. It never gains full recognition, but American Marines protect it, and a semi independent East Timor emerges a decade earlier. Tensions with Indonesia are never cooled, and the 1965 coup overthrowing Sukarno doesn't happen. But the chickens do come home to roost. By 1966, college students are protesting Nixon's African adventures. Draft notices go to advisors headed to both the Congo and Southeast Asia.
A major scandal erupts when a journalist reveals a secret U.S. base in Katanga. Congress investigates. Nixon denies knowledge. Plausible deniability becomes the phrase of the day.
Still, it's hard to argue with the results. The USSR's influence in Central Africa definitely stalls. The Jakarta Beijing alliance ultimately fractures under pressure. So, what if Nixon had won in 1960? You'd get a harder edge Cold War, more realpolitik, more risk, and a world in which Congo and East Timor become ground zero for an American experiment in hegemony.
And you get a version of the 60s where the United States plays empire, not with armies, but with engineers, geologists, and secret cables.
It's the domino theory flipped on its head. Rather than stopping the spread of communism militarily, Nixon tries to preempt it, promoting one secession at a time. Now, here's the real curveball. In this Nixon timeline, Vietnam doesn't become the grinding quagmire we know from our history. And no, it's not because Nixon pulls out.
Nor does he escalate it like LBJ or like his predecessor Eisenhower had insisted would be a good idea. Instead, Vietnam becomes managed, tense, yes, bloody at times, but as some would say, manageable.
That is probably because Nixon doesn't panic over Diem. In our original timeline, Kennedy greenlit a coup against South Vietnamese President Ngo Diem in 1963. But Nixon, who met Diem in 1953 and strongly respected his anti communism, chooses containment over chaos.
He doesn't try to mold Diem into a democratic reformer. Instead, he counsels him to stabilize the streets. And here's the key: he suggests a face saving move. Send Diem's brother, Nguyen, the real firebrand, on a year-long fact-finding tour.
It's a sabbatical, really. New is sent to Rome and Paris, Saigon's sister cities, to study anti communist methods. In reality, it's exile with a smile and a lot of spending money.
Yeah, that changes the game. Without news, harsh crackdowns and raids on Buddhist pagodas, the 1963 Buddhist crisis fizzles. Kwang Duk never burns. Western journalists don't descend en masse, and Diem stays in power, bruised but stable.
At the same time, Nixon brings in a familiar figure from our time, Air Marshal Nguyen Cao Ki, a rising figure with ambition and flair. Rather than fear him, Nixon grooms him, convincing Diem to name him Deputy Commander in Chief of the Armed Forces. Key is flashy, yes, but also modern, and the troops love him.
Yeah, Nguyen Cao Ki becomes the Eisenhower to Diem's Churchill. Military muscle, jet pilot swagger, and fluent in French and charm. Diem keeps the throne. Key commands the ranks. A tense alliance, but it works.
Meanwhile, American involvement stays somewhat limited. The CIA, SEAL units, advisors, but no ground divisions. Nixon coins the phrase sustainable resistance. His mantra, learning from the Korean experience, is no American infantry in Asia without total control of the air.
So by 1965, the U.S. has 100,000 advisors, quote, and air support teams, but no draft, no TET, no Mile. Hanoi still backs the Viet Cong, but finds the South more resilient than expected. And with China watching Taiwan, they can't throw everything into the jungle.
And here's the final kicker. Without the chaos of Diem's assassination and the coup of the week over the next 3 years, and without LBJ's credibility gamble, Vietnam never dominates the headlines. Protests still happen, sure, but they're about Katanga, civil rights, or even student loans.
Vietnam becomes a simmering conflict, like Korea, without the firestorm. Nixon's team dubs it a thorn, not a tumor. And the Nixon doctrine proves it can contain communism without becoming it. But let's pivot south to Rhodesia. That's right, Southern Africa's other Cold War headache. In our timeline, Rhodesia's white minority government declared unilateral independence in 1965, defying Britain and setting off a global controversy. The U.S. condemned it, eventually imposing sanctions. But under Nixon, things go differently in this timeline.
By 1964, Nixon views Rhodesia not just as a rogue colony, but as a potential Katanga-style buffer. He has back channels with Portuguese Angola, South Africa, and the remnants of the Belgian colonial networks, which give him insight into Rhodesia's mineral output and anti-communist posture.
Privately, Nixon calls in Smith prickly, but on the right side. Instead of full condemnation, Nixon urges negotiated recognition, proposing a 5-year transition plan to shared rule while keeping the Rhodesian military loyal to the West.
And in a very bold gamble, Nixon takes the advice of noted political science guru Robin Moore and greenlights a quiet influx of American consultants, not just military, but medical, agricultural, even a number of educators that speak African languages. The goal is to stabilize white control long enough to win time and then engineer a moderated handoff to the right kind of African government.
Hmm. This infuriates the British Labour government and fractures NATO's Africa desk. Harold Wilson calls it cowboy diplomacy, but Nixon's response: better cowboys than communists.
The Soviet Union, as in our time, starts funneling weapons to the Zimbabwe African National Union and the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army insurgents, two African guerrilla groups that didn't like each other even more than the whites. But Nixon doubled down, bolstering intelligence support for the Rhodesian security forces and encouraging South African technical aid.
By 1968, in this timeline, the U.S. has carved out a quiet but undeniable pro Western bloc across southern Africa: Rhodesia, Katanga, Portuguese Angola, and Mozambique. He calls it the Southern Shield.
It's certainly fragile, it's controversial, but it buys time and becomes Nixon's greatest geopolitical experiment. Can you reform authoritarian allies from within while denying the Soviets even a single domino?
By 1968, Nixon's foreign policy is a mixed bag. He's held the line in Vietnam, propped up Katanga, boosted Ambino, and now hedges Rhodesia. He's avoided war, sort of, but at the cost of cozying up to men the New York Times calls the last colonists. Under Nixon, the U.S. doesn't ignore racial injustice, but it calculates. Nixon's approach isn't idealism, it's hard eyed strategy. He knows white rule can't last forever, but he also knows that sudden purges of settler and buffer groups, Indians, Chinese, coloreds, even missionaries, have left power vacuums across Africa. He calls it the Mozambique mistake. In a 1964 internal memo in this timeline, Nixon writes, it's not enough to grant independence. You must secure competence, cohesion, and capital.
To Nixon, these buffer groups, having been treated better by colonialists, are often allied with capitalism and Judeo Christian tradition. But they aren't colonial lackeys. They are the connective tissue of a post colonial survival. Kick them out, and you get internecine conflict and chaos. Keep them in, and you just might build something lasting, approaching a partnership.
So when Ian Smith and Rhodesia's white elite declare UDI, unilateral independence, Nixon doesn't endorse it outright, but he stalls U.S. condemnation. He offers quiet counsel. You must evolve or you will be erased. Now we need to pause for a moment on something that doesn't make it into many textbooks, but Nixon knew it instinctively. Every colonial system left behind a ladder, and someone stood on the middle rung. We're talking about intermediary indigenous groups, not the white settlers, not the poorest laborers, but those communities who had worked with colonial powers, sometimes by choice, sometimes by coercion, and served as interpreters, clerks, officers, even diplomats.
In Nigeria, it was the Igbo, often educated, often Christianized, seen by the British as a modernizing tribe. In Rhodesia, the Matabele had been used as internal enforcers, soldiers, mediators, in some cases, civil servants. And in South Africa, despite apartheid, the Zulu had a unique military legacy and an uneasy quasi partnership with both Boer and British governments.
These were proud nations. They didn't see themselves as traitors, they saw themselves as protectors of continuity. Interesting. Trying to adapt to survive.
But in many post independent African countries and movements, they became scapegoats. They were branded collaborators, their property was seized, they were hounded and purged. In Nigeria, the Igbo would eventually flee or try to create their own country, Biafra. Nixon saw the pattern forming again and moved fast.
In a series of private meetings in 1966 and 1967, what aides called mid rung memoranda, Nixon dispatched diplomats to Lusaka, Lagos, and Gaborone. The message? You need these people. Don't repeat the Congo.
In Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda was planning to restructure the military, purging those trained by the British. Nixon sends the word keep the Lozi and Tonga intermediaries in place. They know how to run a modern war, how to deal with supply lines and transport.
In Nigeria, during the early rumblings of Biafra, Nixon quietly urges federal leaders don't humiliate the Igbo. Give them a ministry, give them finance, or you'll have a war.
And in Rhodesia, Nixon tells Ian Smith and the emerging African moderates if you can't keep entire power, keep your memory. The Matabele have administrative experience. They've seen both sides. Use that. So, what we're looking at here, friends, is a different world that would have happened if Nixon had been elected. It wouldn't have been a utopia by any means. Some good things would have happened, some not so good things, but we would be looking at things from a completely different viewpoint now. And that's what makes history so interesting, the opportunity to roll the dice.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I must say that I don't agree. Um, I did have the opportunity to meet Nixon when he was president, and he was a very nice and personable person in person. His politics and his political savvy, I would still say, are highly questionable. And, I don't think things would have gone exactly this way, but I think it is fascinating to look at it and we can learn some things from it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that not everything would have been the way it was looked at. I just wanted to look at something that had, I mean, I think, as I said before to you, the Cuban crisis and Vietnam have been done to death. So I thought, how would some of these same ideas work somewhere else?
Absolutely. And as I say, it is very interesting and it is instructional, it's educational, it's fun, it's good.
We really enjoy doing these, friends. It's you're like a child again, able to pretend things, but on a
Yeah.
much larger scale. It's a lot of hard work, but a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think that does it for this one tonight. Please leave us a like, a comment, make suggestions if you have any, and look at our sister website, Things You Don't Know. A lot of interesting things happening over there.
Okay. Well, as we say, goodbye for now and please come back. Bye.
So long for now.